In an age where the internet promises infinite connection, we're somehow more fragmented than ever. Disembodied minds scrolling for meaning. But maybe the answers lie not in the algorithm, but in the strange, beautiful chaos we've forgotten to look at. Welcome to the Grateful Podcast. I'm Jack Wagoner, and today I'm joined by Professor Justin Smith Ruiu, philosopher, historian of ideas, and author of The Internet is Not What You Think It Is. Through his Substack, The Hinternet, he explores consciousness, identity, and the limits of reason, inviting us to see both ourselves and our digital world with new and ancient eyes. Justin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Of course, yeah. I was very interested. The way I came across you was I started reading Open Socrates by Agnes
Yeah,
Callard, and I looked her up and I saw you associated with her, and then I
yeah,
read some of your stuff.
yeah.
But
Agnes is great. Yeah,
yeah, and I love that book. It's very, very interesting.
it's good.
But as I researched you a little more, I just saw so many different connections. Like we talked about
Hmm.
France, and then
Hmm.
so the things we're interested in as well. It's very cool.
Hmm.
So I'm really
Hmm.
excited for this.
Absolutely.
So one of the places that I wanted to start was that um, we both obviously share a love of philosophy. It may be at different levels, but as a lover of philosophy in contemporary society, and I bet you too, have run into the problem that many people find philosophy and similar pursuits to be almost pointless. There's a nihilism around philosophy that I find fascinating in a very concerning way. It
Hmm.
seems like it has distanced itself from the world a little bit. But when you look back at ancient times, philosophers were some of the most respected people in
Hmm.
society. So today, with all of our science and religion, it seems to have lost its place outside of
Hmm.
purely academic circles. What do you
Hmm.
believe is the cause of philosophy's exile from everyday life?
Such a complicated question. It's hard to know where to begin. You rightly pointed out or emphasized the role of love in the philosophical life, in any philosophical undertaking. Love is contained in the word philosophy. Some people have interpreted that to mean, in fact, that when the term was originally used by Heraclitus, he used the term to describe the philosophers, that a philosopher was originally someone who loved wisdom because precisely he didn't have it, right? So the philo then is not the philo of someone who's like in the midst of delectation of the object of love, but might be something more like better translated as like wannabe, right? A philosopher is wannabe wise. A philosopher desires wisdom and ipso facto doesn't have it, right? And I think that's always
Yeah.
really important to emphasize about the notion. And it was in its original usage. Pejorative. It was an insult to call someone a philosopher. And I don't think we should necessarily lose that historical connotation of the term. There is something a bit sketchy about this form of life, and also we have to be very sensitive to the multiple meanings that philosophy has had over its 2,500-year history. I chart this all out in an earlier book called The Philosopher, A History in Six Types. The meaning of philosophy in 2025 barely has anything to do with its primary meanings, say, in the period I study, circa 1650. In 1650, you find people describing such undertakings as, trying to make artificial coolants out of saltpeter and niter and stuff like that. Philosophy, right? If you do that
Interesting.
today, it's not philosophy, it's experimental science, or it's probably amateur science. And I'm being as attached to the 17th century as I am, I'm kind of open to alternative conceptions of what philosophy might be, including philosophy capacious enough to include all of what we call today science. And the distinction between the two really only emerged in the 19th century, right? Which is like yesterday for me. But nonetheless, that said, I do recognize and cherish and defend a distinct domain of human endeavor that I sometimes call philosophy. I sometimes call it more broadly humanistic inquiry and reflection, that is quite distinct from science, that's quite distinct from everything we understand under the new label of STEM, the STEM disciplines. And to that extent, I think there really is a kind of intellectual project that needs to be defended, that can be called philosophical, in which our primary aim is not, as they say today, and as we're forced to say in grant applications, is not knowledge production. There's no question of coming up with applicable research results, as they also like to say today. The reflection is itself the true and only end of the undertaking, right? And to that extent, I am extremely defiant of this emerging system, and it's really only emerging in, say, the past 10 or 15 years, whereby philosophers are being forced into a subordinate position relative to the quantitative, data-driven sciences, and increasingly, in order to get grants and so on, philosophers are being forced to imitate scientists, to pretend to operate with the same aims and objectives and with the same methodology. When I'm writing a grant application and I get to the methodology section, I'm tempted to just write, NA, not applicable, right? Like, what the hell do you think my methodology is? I read, I think, and I write, just like philosophers have done for millennia. Why would there be any other methodology to philosophy than that? So the kind of philosophy that I cherish and that I still think has a place in the 21st century is indeed under threat, is indeed marginalized, subjected to the standards of fields that don't share in its spirit, and so on. And that is a real problem. And ultimately, I don't mean to rush right to the heavy stuff, but ultimately I think the reasons for this are economic. It's our economic system that creates imperatives that for anyone who's engaged in a socially recognizable activity, that make it virtually impossible to be a philosopher, right? For a while, in some developed countries in the post-war period, they ran a little experiment where they created philosophy departments and paid people good salaries and gave them tenure and health insurance and called them philosophers and let them do their thing, right? But I think that's probably a pretty brief moment in history, and we're moving back into a more kind of ruthless world that just doesn't have place for that kind of free, directionless reflection as a legitimate social activity.
Right. I am actually very curious because while I was in France, I felt like
Hmm.
there was this very hierarchical system in
Yeah,
education where when you get to high school, you choose a specialty, right? And
yeah,
so the quote unquote smart kids were often uh, encouraged to specialize in math and physics and that scientific path. And the other kids that wanted to be smart or successful would then go, and it results in this brain drain in the
yeah,
humanities and
yeah,
philosophy.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I wonder if that's part of the problem that we're seeing with this switch of from the core values of philosophy to more trying to quantify it and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I
Do
mean,
you agree?
sure, yeah, yeah. It's a special case in France. The old regime is breaking down now, but for at least a couple centuries, in France, they really did, to some extent, succeed in setting philosophy up as a kind of civic religion in Rousseau's sense,
Hmm.
and this could be seen in the kind of public celebration of prominent French philosophers in the annual ceremony of the back, the test that
Yeah.
students take to get into the university in philosophy. That
Right.
is, there's buzz about what this year's bac philo question is going to
Hmm.
be and stuff like that. Like that, like you don't get buzz about something like that in the United States. There's it's just
Right.
out of the question. So for a couple centuries then, and of course, right after the French Revolution, in the most kind of zealous moments of the Jacobin reign, they took over the Catholic churches and turned them into what they actually called temples of reason, right? Which
Hmm.
really shows like literally, when we talk about philosophy as the French civic religion, it's not an exaggeration. But you could say that in the 21st century, nonetheless, France is losing its religion, which is to say,
Yeah.
philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Because the economic pressures that you find everywhere else are seeping in here as well. However much French society tends to be protectionist and try to keep the reality of the rest of the modern world out. I used to say that in a sense, well, the big difference between France and the United States is that if you meet a 18-year-old high school kid who's interested in talking about philosophy, like you, for example, you've met someone interesting. It's like, wow, okay, this is a special person. This is someone who needs to be kind of mentored and guided and encouraged, right? If you meet an 18-year-old French kid, traditionally, who can quote Descartes or Nietzsche, the thought is kind of like, well, who cares? Of course you
Normal.
can. You
You
just
have to for the buck.
yeah. Yeah, right. And in that respect, I've often said that there are benefits of coming from an anti-intellectual culture, right? Intellectual Americans are very special intellectuals because there's nothing in their culture that would predetermine that outcome, right? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's how I've tended to feel. But really, I've been in France for 12 years now, and I can say that within these 12 years, I have seen significant decay of that old civic religion and significant infiltration of the same economic forces and therefore the same mentality that shapes everyday life in the rest of the world too. That is to say, people are more and more inclined to say, who's got time for Nietzsche, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so that's worrisome. But wait, I forget why we talk. Oh, right. So yeah, what you observed during your junior year in Toulouse is indeed correct. Increasingly, there is a strong incentive for French lycée students to orient themselves towards the STEM disciplines, or towards finance. If
That's worldwide as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This is a global development, and even a protectionist society like France can't fully defend itself from it or keep these global forces out.
Yeah. So, do you think that philosophy's lost its respect a little bit as a pursuit?
Well, again, it's not like it's always been all that well respected.
Right.
Again, I started out with Heraclitus, thought philosophers were ridiculous. I mean, he was himself a philosopher, but he didn't call himself that. And if you read Molière, for example, no stock character gets lampooned more viciously in the plays of Molière than the philosopher, right? They're ridiculous people. They've got their head in the clouds. They recite ridiculous Latin formulas that supposedly give them this magic superior power of clear, logical, deductive reasoning and so on, but they're really just totally incompetent when it comes to the actual complexities of the world. So that's been a common view throughout history, but I don't think we ever had a moment of history where philosophy was devalued primarily in virtue of its economic unviability, quite to this extent. That's the big difference. Today, unlike in the era of Heraclitus or Molière, we are living under the reign of economic imperative like never before.
Right. People don't put value on asking questions and getting behind life and the answers behind life because they're so focused on optimizing their external life and making money and
Yeah,
doing these things. We've
yeah,
lost, there seems to be, we have no time to ask these questions.
yeah. Yeah. I think that's true, and of course, this brings up an important point. I think you said optimizing, the term that we also hear a lot coming out of, I assume, Silicon Valley. I don't know when exactly, but it spread to social media. Is maxing.
Yeah.
Like what's his name, Brian Johnson. You know about him,
Yeah.
the
Infinite
40
life, man.
the 46-year-old guy who's like drinking his son's plasma or something. So he is life maxing, right? And he's got all of the metrics on everything his body is doing at every moment. And that is a kind of perversion or even a mockery of the Socratic imperative to know thyself, right? I know myself because I check my blood sugar at 15-minute intervals or something like that. Socrates would say, well, yeah, but that's not yourself. That's just your blood sugar, right? So it's a rigorously materialistic conception of the self that would treat our Fitbit metrics and that kind of information, that kind of data, as self-knowledge. But that is what we tend to do today. Also, if there is philosophy there, the philosophical tradition that figure like Brian Johnson harmonizes with most is utilitarianism, right? And in fact, the ideology of Silicon Valley that is transforming the world at present, and I say Silicon Valley here only as a kind of metonymy, is one that is rigorously utilitarian. That is to say, it tends to take for granted that life is about optimization, which is to say that you've got to get your utilitarian calculator out and start adding up or doing your arithmetic to determine which course of action brings the most what do they call them, hedonic units or something like that.
In
And
economics, it's utility.
yeah. And obviously, that kind of quantified science of human life has been very powerful since the early 19th century. It has delivered tremendous goods, but it's as if it is blind to the force that actually shapes human life, which is often totally uh, 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 un, intractable in such utilitarian terms. What should we call that force? I don't know. But the terms to articulate it would clearly not come from the utilitarian tradition, but from other alternative traditions, like radically alternative traditions, like existentialism or Christianity or any number of other transcendental mysticism and so on. There are a lot of alternatives that simply cannot be captured by a belief system that takes it for granted that the greatest good for a human life is maxing out your Fitbit metrics, right, so to speak, right?
Right.
I don't think people even wear Fitbits anymore, but the whatever devices they're using
Alternative.
now. Yeah.
Yeah. So if that isn't the all pursuit of life, then what should humans be pursuing? What are humans pursuing?
Well, I mean, I don't have any prescriptions, that I'm not that kind of philosopher. I always insist, like, and Foucault said this very well at some point, when he had been pushing his resolutely pessimistic genealogical analyses of modernity for a couple decades. People started saying, "Hey, come on, Foucault, give us give us something to work with, give us an action plan." And he was like, "Sorry, I'm not that kind of thinker. I tell
Yeah.
you what's wrong, and other people can tell you what we should do instead." I don't want to exaggerate, but I do feel more like a Foucauldian in that regard. I'm more interested in I'm more interested in griping, basically. I mean, that's one way to put it.
A critic of life.
Yeah. I mean, you need people doing both things. You need constructive, proactive thought, and you need critical, destructive thought. They
Yeah.
go together.
Well, you are one thing that you've been very openly critical about uh is the internet.
Mm.
Um and uh, I'd say that's a fair thing to say, a technological cynic. Um do you what are you how do you feel about where we're going with this technology and going toward more material things and coming back to what we were talking about, where we are kind of losing our introspection
Yeah.
How is this going to balance out, and what do you see as like the harms of that?
Well, let me first say, so my book, The Internet is Not What You Think It Is, came out in 2022. And that means it's already ancient history. It's totally irrelevant to the landscape of 2025. And the reason for that is that the commercially available LLMs that really define what online experience is in 2025 were only just beginning to appear in 22 and were basically not on the radar. I mean, people were like talking about whether Zuckerberg's metaverse was going to take off at around the moment I submitted the manuscript. When is the last time you heard people talking about Facebook metaverse, right? That's kind of
Ancient.
fizzled. And so things change really, really fast, and they're going to keep changing really, really fast. And that kind of means that if you want to write a book about the internet, you gotta reckon with the fact that it's going to have a pretty short shelf life. I'm not saying I said nothing in that book that is still relevant, but I'm just saying inevitably my considerations now are rather different, and just like everyone else, I think the primary focus in 2025 is rightly generative AI. That is what
Yeah.
we should be thinking about right now, and that brings brings the kind of concerns that I expressed in that book up to a whole nother level of urgency. Generative AI effectively gives a kind of superpower boost or thrust to the some of the processes that I described in terms of algorithmic determinism and so on in the book of 2022. Now, what I like to emphasize, though, and maybe this message didn't come through enough in 2022, is that I'm not entirely cynical in that I do tend to think that the current technological revolution could, let's say, also the current revolution in the history of information technology in particular.
Okay.
That's how we
Yeah.
need to express it. Could open up a breach for the new assertion of human freedom, such as we might have thought was entirely lost some decades ago. What I mean by that is that, well, first of all, I'm very keen, as you know, not just a philosopher but also a historian. I'm very keen on thinking about our current revolution um, uh, through the lens of previous revolutions in information technology. There are two that are most important. One is the first invention of writing in Mesopotamia, somewhat different course of development in ancient China some millennia ago. The other, and the one that I know better, is the printing revolution that begins in the late 15th century in Europe. I'm convinced that that pretty much everything that happens in the following centuries after the arrival of the printing press is more or less directly causally connected to the printing press. That is to say, the rise of the nation state, the aspiration to democracy, the Protestant Reformation, eventually the emergence of secularism and the separation of church and state, and ultimately the world we live in now, all can be traced back to new developments in the way information circulates, mostly from the end of the 15th century. And that caused a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of death, a lot of people got burned at the stake for smuggling English language Bibles across the channel and so on. These days, no one's trying to outlaw the circulation of Bibles in languages besides Latin. You know, the things we're worried about have changed, but in general, in the broad outlines, it's all happening over again. And if history is any guide, it doesn't have to repeat itself, it only has to rhyme. If history is any guide, we're going to see a lot of chaos and disruption and suffering to come as a consequence of our new revolution in information technology. However, very few people since the end of the 15th century have just flat out said, you know what, I really wish they never started printing books, right? I mean, you know, no one is 100% filled with regret that we started printing books or that we started writing 5,000 years ago. And similarly, I am not 100% down on the internet, right? I think it's going to make a huge mess of things. It's already turned everything we thought was familiar and stable upside down in the course of my lifetime, and that's going to keep happening. However, just as the circulation of printed matter opened up new possibilities for humanity, I cannot but think that the same thing is going to happen again. Concretely, I'm optimistic that the new power of generative AI to take care of tasks that we might describe as outsourced reason. We outsource our faculty of reason to machines to let them take care of certain drudging tasks for us, could free us up to do better things with our time. And this is particularly important when it comes to the humanities. I think 20 years ago, it was already strained to suggest that in writing a grant application, a humanist should talk about their research results and their methodology and so on. I think in 2025, it is prima facie absurd to keep pretending that there is a place in the world for humanities scholars, including philosophers, and that's contentious, I know, but let's just put it that way. I think it's prima facie absurd in 2025 to suppose that there's a place in the world for humanities scholars who model the work they do on the work of laboratory scientists in terms of research results and data and stuff like that. Let the LLMs do it. Enough of all that. They can do the distant reading of vast corpora of Sanskrit texts and tell us how many times this or that word occurs, and they can do it all, right? And that leaves us actual humanists, us human humanists, to do what was always our true purview, which is to reflect on profound questions in ways that machines patently cannot and never will be able to, right? So in that regard, I'm worried about the total chaos our information revolution has unleashed, but I'm also cautiously optimistic.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Grateful Podcast. I'm interrupting to let you know that it would mean the world to me if you could share this episode with someone that you think would enjoy it, or leave a review down below so I can learn what I can do better and what I'm doing well with this podcast. It's a passion project, and I really want it to turn into something that helps people everywhere. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. I love that. Yeah. There are two main things I took away from that. The first is that when there's new information technology, there seems to be this acceleration of entropy in society, where we start to tend more rapidly toward chaos because information can spread quicker, so we can make quicker decisions. The second thing is that hopefully with this new technology, we'll be able to free up more time to reflect
Yeah.
and introspect.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that that could be incredibly, incredibly profound for humanity if
Sure.
each
Yeah.
individual can reflect on their life more
Yeah.
and be more of an individual philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. It's not going to be easy, and in part, again, we have to return to the economic model on which these new information technologies are being run, and what we find here is that, as with previous revolutions, inequality somehow manages to survive under the new circumstances. And technological advances tend not in themselves to offer solutions to inequality, and they might even exacerbate them. So when and there are classic examples of how this works. In the 19th century, nobody had cars, so everyone lived close to where they worked. Then they go and invent the automobile, and then everyone's like, oh, this is great. Now we can live further from where we work. And then by the late 20th century, a whole bunch of sorry working suckers have to spend a considerable portion of their day in traffic jams, and their lives haven't improved at all, right? And similarly, and in an even more aggravated way, I would say, the new possibility of dematerialized banking, grade submission, medical consultation, social security, information retrieval, stuff like that. The fact that we've got this all online now should have been making life easier. But damn it, my life doesn't feel any easier than it used to be. In fact, I feel like a lot of days my life is primarily spending huge cognitive energy trying to reset passwords, find old passwords, trying to figure out why some stupid platform won't let me in, what I'm doing wrong, and stuff like that. And I often feel like this has been a really, really bad exchange, and so technological advances in themselves, don't make us more equal and happy. In fact, they just, serve as the occasion to, make us miserable in new ways. And this is, of course, we frequently hear the term techno-feudalism today. And I really do think that is a fairly accurate term to describe this new situation where whoever you are, unless you're rich enough to pay a full-time personal assistant, you spend a lot of your cognitive energy resetting passwords, and it doesn't feel like that's freeing up a lot of time to do philosophy, So what we will need then is not just new and better information technologies, but also properly old-fashioned political demand for human rights specific to this new technological regime.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because we can almost equate society with an overachieving individual,
Hmm.
where where the overachieving individual will say, "Once I accomplish this, I'll have more time to do this." But once
Yeah,
they accomplish that, they end up just continuing and getting the next thing and the next thing. And
yeah,
so we say, once we get the internet, or let's even go back even further, once we get the printing press,
mm,
we'll be able to free up more time. Once we get the
yeah,
internet, we'll be able to free up more time. And that free time just goes to creating more, and it's this
yeah,
infinite
yeah.
loop that
And the
we
free time never
never.
comes. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly, yeah.
you're right. Yeah.
So it's like I'm very skeptical of what we talked about with AI freeing up time for introspection.
Hmm.
That would be amazing.
Hmm.
But all previous all previous indicators point to us just using that free time
Yeah.
to create more opportunities and technology in the future.
Yeah, I guess what I mean when I say I'm cautiously optimistic, it has less to do with a mass transformation of society, as rather, I hope, we'll see a transformation in the understanding of what those relatively narrow domains we call humanistic inquiry and academic philosophy are. For the
That makes
for the
sense.
past few decades, these have been increasingly subordinated to imperatives defined by the STEM disciplines, and I think that subordination just can't last. Something's got to give. And I think the arrival of LLMs and the clear fact that that they can just do all our distant reading and information transfer on their own is going to be the blow that that destroys the model of the academic humanities that I have been compelled to work under for the past years. And I say good riddance because it's unviable.
Interesting. Do you think that this constant pushing forward in technology ends up creating a more individualistic culture, or is it the individualism that creates the materialism?
Well, it's strange. I mean, because we're, I, I don't know if individualism is the right word. I mean, materialism is strictly correct in the old philosophical sense. Brian Johnson
Yeah.
is a materialist, right? He
Right.
thinks he
Would ego be the better word? Egoistic,
well,
egotistical?
but that as well. And let me explain why I'm hesitant to describe the to describe technology as having an individualistic bent.
Yeah.
Because it seems, especially when you look at how social media communication works, it seems that what it's really uh, uh, pushing us towards is mass conformism, and you have some degree of choice as to which group you want to conform to, but you got to conform to a group, one group
Hmm.
or other, right? And this is so clear from the kind of dynamics of polarization that we've been observing in social media over the past 15 years or so, that unfortunately, I mean, it almost makes me want to say, would that people were a bunch of individualists. I think
Yeah.
it would be far more interesting. Instead, what we get is mimetic duplication or mimetic transmission of shared commonplaces that do nothing to provide us a kind of healthy range of options to consider in reflecting on, say, difficult political questions. Now, much of this is by design, and again, I get back to economics. I don't mean to sound like such a Marxist today. I mean, it wasn't really my intention, but sometimes I get on that horse, and I just can't get off. But this is by design. We know that social media are set up in such a way that the more extreme your formulation of your view, the more traction it's going to get, and the more kind of cautious or ambivalent your formulation is, the less traction it's going to get. So our dopamine reward system then is kind of predetermined towards radicalization, towards polarization then. But it obviously doesn't have to be that way. Something I wrote a while ago, I was thinking, conceivably, there could be dialectical social media, right? Where instead of the metrics or the algorithm favoring extreme formulations of your position against those of someone else, you could have the platform set up where someone would get algorithmic perks, more exposure, more traffic, in virtue of having provided a kind of higher level synthesis of opposed views, right? So two people are fighting on social media. You intervene as a third person and you say something that takes up something from what both of them have said, but move it to a higher level. The platform would reward you for that, would give you points, and it would give you a rush of dopamine, and you'd see those likes, and it would just lube up your brainstem, and you would love it, right? And we could have a society that worked like that, or we could have a technological platform around which society is organized that worked like that, and it would probably be a disaster too. There would probably be problems that I can't even anticipate that would emerge from it. But still, it seems like an alternative experiment that's certainly worth trying out, because the last 15 years have been an absolute shit show. Sorry, am I allowed to say that politically? I mean,
You're fine.
it's been insane, and a lot of the insanity can be traced directly back to the way profit incentives structure social media algorithms. It's that simple. It's not a mystery.
Right. Oh, that's a very interesting point, and I'd love to see a social media platform like that. Or I don't think we could do it now because of how far we've come, but I
Yeah,
would love to like be able to go back into a little time machine and
yeah,
plant that as the first Facebook, that is the
yeah, yeah,
algorithm
yeah,
that
yeah,
things are based on, and see how that
yeah.
would have played out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I similarly, I don't have any viable alternatives for the moment. I mean, some people talk about nationalizing social media, for example, and what I tend to say is like the one thing here. I guess I'm not much of a Marxist. The one thing that would be worse than private companies controlling social media for the sole purpose of their own profit extraction. The one thing that would be worse than that is governments controlling social media. I think
Yeah.
both are disaster, and I suppose here, the only plausibly salutary control, control that would benefit the people who use it, is some kind of community-based grassroots collectivity that makes its own social media. And you see a little bit of that, and there are certainly subcultures where that is very prevalent, but still it's not exactly what's shaping world history right now.
Yeah. What I found interesting going back to beforehand when you talked about conformism and social
Mm-hmm.
media really amplifying conformity is how humans are very egotistical, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just naturally, you've said that the self is merely a grammatical convenience, which I find very interesting,
Oh yeah.
because in a way, uh, social media is taking us away from that
Mm-hmm.
self, while in so many other ways it's propelling it. There's this duality here that's really hard to grasp and figure out on a macro level which direction is it taking us in.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I agree. Did I say that? Well, if I said the self is a grammatical convenience, I mean, that's certainly a compelling account of the self in various schools of thought in the history of philosophy, including many schools of Buddhism. Arguably, David Hume thinks something like that. So it's not unknown, and I'm kind of sympathetic to it, but I there are also times when I think that the self is a properly, transcendental metaphysical subject. I don't know.
Yeah.
These are tough
Yeah, no,
questions.
we don't. No one knows.
Nobody knows. Yeah, but in any case, what I am fairly certain of is that our idea of selfhood is historically contingent, and it is very much wrapped up in our practices, including our the way we interact with our technologies. And this is another thing that, much like with the printing press and the other new technologies at the beginning of the modern era, where I think we can already say 100 years from now, if we survive, the reigning philosophical theories of what an individual self is are going to be unrecognizable relative to anything we have seen up until now. That is to say, our technologies are going to transform radically the way we think about it, what it is to be a self, a moral subject, an individual person existing across time, and so on. They're already changing radically, but it's just the beginning. One of the ways they're changing radically, I think, is that we are increasingly able to externalize our selfhood in both terrifying and exciting new ways. And I think for example, the prospect of having personality emulating AIs that will be trained up on us over the course of our lives. Whether our consciousness can ever be successfully uploaded into them or not, that's a separate issue. If we do have AIs that can master our personalities and continue after our deaths, there are very, very significant interpersonal, emotional, but also legal and financial implications for this. Like, if you could get a perfect duplicate of my reasoning running before I die, for example, then you could argue that the idea that, say, my fortune, my estate, I don't have a fortune, but supposing I did, that my estate should be delivered over to someone else after I die, rather than just managed by my personality emulator.
Right.
It becomes really complicated, and I think these transformations are coming very soon. We know already that in Japan and Korea in particular, there are significantly fewer legal and cultural obstacles to virtual reality simulation of deceased people. And it's becoming fairly common to offer services whereby you can interact with your deceased loved ones. That's something that is, for now, in Western Europe, entirely taboo, and there are government panels that are talking about this and about how to prevent it happening. But the truth is, when things like this start happening, again, we get back to the question of French protectionism. They tried to shut out the internet to keep their own homegrown Minitel going for a while. They tried to shut out Uber. They're gonna try to shut out virtual reality loved ones, deceased loved ones. But they're gonna, if they're doing it in Japan and Korea, they're gonna be doing it in France sooner or later, right?
Yeah.
That's just how the world works.
That's crazy. It implies that there's a difference between a being and an organism, which is very interesting. Very interesting implication there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot, and you might know the philosopher David Chalmers. He might be someone good for you to talk to as well. He wrote an interesting book that I've been critical of, but it was interesting, called Reality Plus, about virtual reality and simulationism and so on. And he's also been interested in the idea of consciousness uploading and the prospect that in the future we can be made immortal just by transferring our personal identity into a silicone substrate. And what's interesting to me about that kind of reasoning from a historical point of view is that it presupposes a Lockean conception of personal identity. That is to say, John Locke argued that you are the same person in virtue of the fact that you have continuity of memory over the course of your life. And then, those kind of Lockean reflections are developed in some of the thought experiments in the, well, he died recently, but basically contemporary philosopher Derek Parfit, who wrote this book called Reasons and Persons. But, we know very well that there are cultures. I'm particularly interested in indigenous Siberian cultures, and we see this practice there, but we in fact see it all over the world, where you don't need complicated silicone chips to transfer identity into another kind of, how should I put it, a vehicle, material vehicle. A simple sculpted piece of wood will do, or a doll, a sort of effigy. Right? Now, what Westerners would say is, oh, well, that's just superstition. That's not actually the person. That's just like a symbolic representation of the person. If you point at a doll and say, that's my grandma, we transferred her soul into the doll when she died, Westerners would say that's just not true. Well, they wouldn't say it to their faces, but they would say, yeah, come on. We all know that's not true. But the reason why that looks so absurd to us, I think, is because we are all Lockeans to the extent that we think if you have no continuity of memory, then you have no continuity of self. Right? And this, I often quote in this connection, this lovely line from something Woody Allen wrote decades ago, which was, how did he put it? I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment, right? Meaning like no consolation for death is really going to cut it, because if you don't get to keep on, sitting on your own couch and drinking your coffee and doing your thing, then it's not you, right?
Right.
But I think that presumption is an anthropologically rather deviant way of thinking about what it is to be a self. And it might be an anthropologically deviant way of thinking about the self that had, note the past tense, that had a very brief period of popularity in the history of philosophy, from roughly the time of John Locke in the late 17th century to the early 21st century. And now that we're witnessing this proliferation of new technologies to emulate personalities and so on, I suspect we're going to start living in a much more hybrid world where we're surrounded by all kinds of different selves, some of which have the kind of organic, biologically based continuity of consciousness that we know and love, that Woody Allen loves, that John Locke loves, but we're also going to be surrounded by, holographs of our dead grandmas, right? And it's going to be a different social reality to learn to navigate. Well, I shouldn't say learn. I suspect young people, babies who are born into such a world, will just take it for granted.
Right.
But I do think it's changing, and I think the change is being driven directly by technology in ways that, again, for me, are both exciting and terrifying. So the idea that I would come out and say, I hate all this, I'm against it, thumbs down, or on the contrary, that I would say, yeah, let's do this, let's plunge into the brave new world, I think both are foolish and simplistic. The only proper disposition to these transformations is a blend of terror and excitement.
That sounds exciting and in
and terrifying.
An interesting way. Yeah, and terrifying. There we go. We got the two there. Well, Justin, this has been phenomenal. I've learned so much.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah. I try to say something new every time I do a podcast. Like I try on the fly to not repeat myself, because by now I've done my fair share of them, and so yeah. I think I managed to get something new in there.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great when you do so many, you often repeat the same things because they're the things that you're comfortable with. That you're passionate about.
Yeah. But it's important that there be a kind of a mix. Yeah.
Exactly. Some novelty to it.
Exactly.
So, as you may have noticed, the title of my podcast is The Grateful Podcast.
Yeah.
I don't always talk about gratitude in the conversation, but when I started, it was more like focus on that. But I've kind of branched out because I'm interested. I just do things I'm interested in. But I have this hypothesis that the best and most fulfilling life is a life in which you're both ambitious, going toward your goals, and grateful for the present moment and what you have. And so I always ask my guests at the end of the show what they're grateful for. So what are you grateful for?
Wow, that is so difficult. I feel like can I start with a bit of an analysis of the concept of gratitude?
I would love it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I'm interested in it, and I've been thinking about it a lot recently. It's etymologically connected to the notion of grace. And also, you probably were in France long enough to become familiar with the word gratuit, like free. That which is free, that which is like given away, and so that is both in an economic sense, but also in a sense that we have from religion, right? That is to say, grace is when you get something you don't deserve, right? So for me, and also. It's also connected to all sorts of other terms that seem very different, but have some semantic link, like a gratuitous sex scene in a movie. It's like, what is that? It's one that doesn't have to be there, right? And that's supposed to be bad, but you can see how it's connected to a notion that's also very good. So,
right.
Gratitude then has to do with those elements of our lives that we get for free, so to speak, that
Mm-hmm.
we didn't get necessarily because of our hard work, or merit. And ultimately, I'm inclined to think that's pretty much everything, right? Why? Well, because, a piano could have fallen on my head a year ago and I wouldn't have anything, right? I'd be dead. I could have fallen ill, which would have been more likely than the cartoon scene of the piano movers. But the simple fact that I still get to be alive and healthy and productive is itself, the thing that I got for free, right, so to speak. If we continue with the semantics of the word, gratitude. And so, I guess, what you say about the perfectly balanced life, it's really hard, and it remains hard for me to figure out the healthy, well-tempered life where our pursuit of projects, of accomplishments, of getting things done, is motivated by the right reasons. We do it
Mm-hmm.
for healthy, edifying reasons rather than because we have a lust for power or fame or glory, or we feel some lack or emptiness inside of ourselves. And I strongly sense that somehow, gratitude as a recognition of the gift of life, of the fact that, we're alive right now by nothing but grace, or as a gift. Again, if you want to put it another way, it comes down to the same thing. Recognizing that and remembering that all the time is really the only way to be able to pursue one's projects, for the right reasons, right?
Yeah.
If you remember that
Yeah.
every day. So that's what I try to do.
I love that so much, and I really
Good.
enjoyed that whole
Yeah.
breakdown of it. I've thought about the word nkletji and like all the different etymology, but never really connected all
Hmm.
the dots. So
Yeah, yeah,
thank you
yeah,
for
yeah.
that.
There's a lot going on there. Yeah, and the notion of gratefulness, gratitude. Yeah, it's connected to so much else that we might not see, on first consideration.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you
Yeah,
for this conversation. I definitely
sure.
learned a ton. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks. Yeah, it was a real pleasure.
Philosophy, man, I love it. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Grateful Podcast featuring Justin Smith. Phenomenal. We covered so many things, and he's a true intellectual. So it was very, very entertaining and uh, educational to hear him speak. And like this, his Substack is very good. You should go check it out. I love his articles, and I'm sure you will as well. I hope you guys have a great week. Stay grateful.